Hey folks, Campbell, MVP here for Threatscape, and in this episode, Jeff Kazimer, Principal PM working on Entra Suite, is here to share practical tips on streamlining identity management, enforcing least privilege, and improving overall security in identity with Entra ID Governance. Let's jump into it. Jeff, what's the one thing that companies keep getting wrong about identity governance, and how does Entra ID Governance fix that type of problem?
Great question. So one of the things that's a common misconception is identity governance is only for the big companies who have a lot of regulatory and compliance. Actually, identity governance is for every company, because that's what we think identity governance is security. Every organization needs to be mindful of governing the access their users have.
Okay, so that's an interesting one, because when I think of the types of companies that are interested in kind of identity governance software, you kind of think of big enterprise scale customer, right?
Yeah.
ID governance are applicable kind of across from everything from small to medium business to enterprise. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, and the reason why is because there's a common thing that all organizations do, and that's the identity lifecycle. Every organization is onboarding users, right? They're creating accounts, giving them initial access, and then managing that access over the lifetime, and then hopefully removing access when they're gone. Every size organization, from a 2-person company to a million user company, has an exact same lifecycle.
Right. And again, one of the other things I see a lot is kind of regardless of the size of the company, even in companies that have enormous IT resources, so much of the joiners, movers, leavers process, things like that, it kind of sucks in so many companies. And it's held together with things like PowerShell scripts and all sorts of manual effort and things like that. So let's assume if I'm a kind of IT admin and I'm looking at my JML and I'm like, you know what, this ain't perfect, but it's okay. What's the incentive and what's the reason to kind of level up and go for a particular product like ID governance?
Sure. So I've been around in the IT world for quite a while, and I've seen the organizations where you would hire somebody and they would be ineffective for maybe 2 to 3 weeks, right? Because there were all these manual processes that were having to happen. Getting an account created, getting your computer order requested, and then figuring out what access you had to have, finding out who you had to ask for, what spreadsheet, what Lotus Notes form you had to fill out to get that access, right? And this was a challenge, right? It took time to be effective in the role. And then we started looking at things like, well, let's start automating this. So we had organizations which had skilled IT professionals who started writing scripts. Now, I remember back in the day, Windows scripting host and VB script and all of the things that I would see be created, and I created myself back then, trying to automate this. But the problem becomes, how do you support and maintain that, right? So you've started the automation, you've scripted it, you have it perfect. That person moves on in their role. They're no longer focused on scripting anymore. Who's supporting that? I've seen the opposite of that. I've worked with customers when I was a consultant where, oh no, the person who was running this has left. We don't know what's going on. And that really impacted the business. So by moving to a process that is repeatable, auditable, and configurable without having a high bar of skill set enables that organization to be secure in their identity governance, not just an afterthought.
Right. That makes a lot of sense, because first off, love the Lotus Notes reference. That gives me horrific flashbacks.
Yes.
In a previous life, I was all over Lotus Notes. But you raise an interesting point. So it's almost like by having a product like identity governance, you're protecting the JML process of the JML process, right? Because, for example, if I'm the IT admin who's holding all this stuff together with my bespoke scripts and the stuff that's all just in my head, well, when I go through that joiners, movers, leavers process as the IT guy and I leave, well, that puts the business at risk, right? So I guess it's a sense that you're getting a fully supported product, the skill set's out there, the documentation's out there. That kind of insures the business a little bit.
And one of the things is the process that we're doing today is going to evolve, right? And one of the challenges that I've seen is once you've established that automation that somebody wrote long ago, you don't want to change it because you don't understand and support it. So what happens is you have partial automation over here, manual processes because you are afraid to touch the thing you can't support, right? And this is a challenge with a lot of traditional IGA tools, right? You would go in there, try to build a business process. You'd have this great idea of having those controls in place. You get 20% done and realize you don't have the skill set to keep continuing without bringing on more staff to support it, right? So we want to move away from that high bar of enabling IGA and bring it closer to what IT pros are. That's when we talk customization. We're really focused on things like low code, no code, right? So we base all of our customizations on Azure Logic apps. So if you're familiar with those, this is that graphical sort of way of doing logic instead of having to write code and some more code to do so. So we feel bringing that governance can bring to every organization, no matter what skill set they are, versus the high bar of those specialized tools.
Right. That's a really interesting point, because you're right. When I think of, at least historically, when I think of IGA and things, I think kind of niche, right? I think very specialized. This is someone's full-time job. But with ID governance, if that opens it up to maybe, and I don't know if this is the right term to use anymore, but you're kind of jack of all trades / sysadmin type, right? Where I've used something like Power Automate or Flow in the past, I can easily get over there because the skill barrier is low. That's what we're aiming for here.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah.
Understood.
So if you look at our provisioning, right? So we talk about the life cycle where it starts with establishing the identity, and it's so critical to have that authoritative data. In many organizations, this is an HR system, right? We've seen this transition from our traditional like on-prem databases to SaaS-based services like Workday SuccessFactors. So those are just applications in Entra. You add them, but then you have to configure them. And that's where we get into just writing expressions, right? Not writing code. Get that data, get it into on-prem AD or Entra if you're going there. And that's so critical because that describes the user. Now we can do the next level. Now that I know I have data telling me when somebody joins, when they move or they leave, I can automate on that. I use it as triggers, right? So you see how we're building this layered up in the life cycle, and we're getting to the point where we can manage the full life cycle, not just when they join, move, or leave, but requesting access over, certifying access, elevating access. It's all part of the same ecosystem, the same life cycle.
Right, understood. For example, I integrate with my HR system. If the attribute in the HR system for that user's department changes or their role changes or something like that, that kicks off these types of logic apps that you mentioned. Is that the process here?
Well, it can be a logic app, but one thing we actually did with Entra ID Governance lifecycle workflows is we looked at all of our history with customers in a large security platform like Entra. What are the common tasks that admins are doing? So we actually have these built-in tasks, right? If you want to send a custom email, if you want to generate a temporary access pass to start your user's password list day one, right? You can do that just with configuration. But then you could do even more advanced things like just processes that we don't think of, right? Because they're unique to that business. And that's where you go to custom tasks, right? That's where you use your logic app to maybe say, hey, when somebody onboards, I'm going to generate that tap, but I don't know where to send it to. But maybe I want to send it to a personal email when they register with HR to get them that first credential. There's a lot of processes, but you can do them all centrally that you could report on, operationalize, and monitor.
That's cool. That's cool. So I kind of, out the box, I get these lifecycle workflows, which maybe cater to, in my head, I'm thinking kind of 80-20 principle, get 80% of the common use cases, but then for my little bespoke things, that's where I can go and, if I'm clinging to my PowerShell scripts and all that in a minute, I can start to
do that.
Release some of that. Well, of course, yeah. So you can integrate that with a Logic app, I'm guessing.
Correct. Yeah. So Azure Automation, right? You can invoke it from there as well. So you can slowly take that library that you are supporting, transition it to a platform that is future supportable, right? So now you can become more governable and more supportable over time.
Right. That was very, very cool. That was very cool. So it's not like I have to kind of do this on take all the scripts and stuff I used to have and just boom, they have to go away. Those can still continue to some degree.
Yeah, over time, right? Because you have a process and you really should have a visibility. And most organizations have a process, right? Whether it is implemented automatically, they may have a SOP, or the admin just knows, right? But the thing is, in that process, how do you ensure every step was done completely, right? So we want to move away from manual administration to augment the admin to enable automation where it's needed and where it adds value.
Understood. And when you think of things like Azure Automation and Azure Logic apps, those will get a cost involved. You kind of pay for the Azure resource and things like that.
Correct.
ID governance is part of Entra Suite, or you can license it standalone. How does the relationship between those two things work? Is there additional costs if I start having customizations?
So great questions. Entra ID is a very established internet identity platform. We had IJ capabilities in Entra ID Premium 2, right? So if you were ever a P2 customer, you would start using things like access packages, access reviews. But we heard customers wanted more. That was a lot of foundational components. We wanted to enable automation and insights. And that's where we enabled Entra ID Governance, right? We're really building on that foundation. Admins already know know Entra ID? How do we get them to enable IGA scenarios to automate those things? So yes, you could do lifecycle workflows, which is out of the box. There's no per workflow cost, right? If you're doing things like custom tasks, there is the Azure Logic Apps invocation cost, right? So how often you're doing that Logic app, it really depends on your process, right? And then we're not just focused on LCW, right? Because we look at access packages, which is part of entitlement management. And that is really our core construct to enable access to be defined, who should be assigned, and the policies that govern it. And one of the policies you actually get with Entra ID Governance is automatic assignments, right? So now I can automatically assign access to an access package based on the HR data. It's a filter similar to dynamic groups, but I think more powerful, right? So now when that access or that personal profile changes from HR, say I move from sales to research, the access can automatically be removed. But one of the key things is with automation, there's actually a business impact, right? I may get a promotion. I may move to a new team today, but there's a handover period, right? Like I don't typically just say bye team, right? So we actually have the ability to maintain some assignments automatically, right? For a period of time. So they will retire, say 7 days after the change, giving a turnover period. But maybe it was a sensitive access. I want to cut it, the day of transition. You have a lot of flexibility, and that's all from configuration, not coding.
That's very cool. So if I make sure I understand that properly, let's create a scenario where I'm in a marketing team and I'm moving to a product team. At the standard P2 level of license, the access packages things, they're probably going to be limited to dynamic groups at best. However, if I have ID governance, I can then use attributes from HR systems and then have this kind of crossover period between those attributes changing. Is that the advantage here?
Yeah. So if you look at the Entra ID dynamic groups capability, that's that filter-based assignment, and it's Boolean. Either I match the filter or I don't match. If I match, I'm assigned. When I don't match, I'm removed from that group assignment. With access packages, we've added a lot more capabilities and intelligence, that transition period, right? Do I want to retain that access for a period of time when I no longer match? And the other benefit is that those same logic apps we have for LCW extensions also apply for access packages. So now when that access is assigned, call this custom logic app task. When the access is removed, call this custom logic app task. So we go way beyond dynamic groups, and we're giving you that capability to automate. That's the key theme: automation and insights in Entra ID governance.
It's very cool. I love this trend of just slapping logic apps on anything. That's because it gives that flexibility, yes. Right? And one other thing that comes to mind when we think about access reviews in ID governance, I've made it so far into the podcast already without saying AI, but my understanding is there's some degree of AI, or at least ML, not from a Gen AI, but from a kind of ML-based process with regards to things like user-to-group affinity and things like that. Could you maybe explain what that means? Because that's a kind of new concept, right?
So let's take a step back, though. Let's talk about the concept of access reviews, right? Access reviews is a process, sometimes called a campaign or a program, where I periodically want to look at a resource and say, well, here's all the assignments to that group, that app, that access package, or that Entra ID role. And I want somebody to say, well, this is correct or it's not correct, right? So we want to avoid the scenario I kind of call the access snowball, where somebody's requesting access over the lifetime, but they never let it go. Nobody ever says, oh, I don't need this anymore. So we have this access review period to say, was it appropriate? Is it still appropriate? And if not, we should remove it. The problem with access reviews, though, is it's a second job, right? Like I have Mary who's in sales, and I'm asking her to review who should have access to the sales team, right? That's not her core role, but I want her to do that. And this becomes kind of like, we call it cognitive overload, right? Where she may say, I don't know, so I don't want to break anything. I just want approval. And that can happen over time, right? So now we bring things like, how do we use like machine learning to help guide the reviewer? And you'll see in our access reviews, we have recommendations, right? So one of those recommendations is for groups called group user affinity, right? Or user group affinity. So let's say I'm reviewing that sales group and I see Mike Smith has been in there, right? And I've been approving it for the last 4 years, but I didn't realize that an admin doing a manual task from a service ticket was asked to add Mike Smith to the sales team. but he picked the wrong Mike Smith. He didn't know. He just was following the process. Mike Smith from accounting has been in the sales team this entire time and nobody knew it. So we can actually utilize that graph, that relationship to raise that insights to the reviewer saying something is amiss here. The affiliation of this Mike Smith to other members of this group is not high, so we recommend that you review it or remove it. But we also look at things like activity, right? This is one of the big benefits of bringing IGA to an identity platform instead of having an IGA tool, is that we're utilizing the signal and activity from the entire Entra and Microsoft security environment to drive decisions. So the other machine learning capability that we bring is activity, right? Is this user active in the environment? Are they signing in? Are they accessing this specific application that I'm reviewing? And we can raise those insights to the reviewer to make a decision about should they retain access. So we make recommendations. The reviewer can just take all recommendations if they want, but they still are empowered to make a decision.
That's really, really good info, because one of the things that admins historically have kind of struggled with using things like Microsoft 365 and Entra is that activity piece, right? Because I guess because of the nature of Entra and the fact that it kind of spills over a whole bunch of Microsoft 365 services, is one thing to go and look at things like the last sign-in data, but then it's another to go away and figure out, well, what about the last activity on that specific app or that specific resource and things like that. So with this identity governance license, I guess you're going to save a little bit of time and effort, right? Because it just makes you a more informed decision maker. Is that fair to say?
Yep. So there's two places that we use activity in access reviews. One is when we scope an access review, I can say I only want to review users who are active for X days. So I only want to review the users who haven't signed in the tenant for 90 days. Now, why is this important? We have large organizations. You can have groups that are 10,000, 100,000 users, right? Nobody's going to go in line by line and review each one. So we could segment the point of the review, the scope of the review, just to be inactive users, because that should be a smaller percentage of those users. So now, instead of looking at 100,000, I may be looking at 20, 50, whatever that is during your period, and I can make a better decision about it. So that is part of the Entra ID governance to scope those access reviews. But the activity is a reviewer helper, right? That tells me when I'm doing a review, is this person active or inactive? And that gives that reviewer some insights to make a decision. So activity is used in two different ways across IGA in this context.
Well, I think that's big, right? Because one of the kind of, you hit the nail on the head earlier when you were talking about, it's cognitive overload and all that kind of things. It's like when you talk to end user organizations, they're kind of like, I don't really want my end users to have to do any more work.
Yes. Yep.
I don't want to end up in the bad side of them. You know what I mean? I don't want to impose anything because folks are already busy, right? But the point here is it's that balancing act, right? Of just enough information, filtering out the potential bad information that doesn't matter. So folks that are active, forget about those potentially.
Yes.
That idea.
But we actually go even further on this. So access reviews, in my view, is managing a part of the access lifecycle. It doesn't say how I was given access to it, right? So we actually want to get to managing the full access lifecycle. So this is where we look at entitlement management. Entitlement management says I create this access package and I have policies of who can request, who can be assigned, who can be approved or who has to approve. But one of the key things is how long should this access persist for, right? So it's not forever. So like traditionally, I'm doing group management in on-prem AD, some tools, some service tickets, some admin. That's not governing what the assignment is. Through entitlement manager access package policies, I can prevent the wrong users from being assigned. And when the right users are assigned, I could limit how long. Let's say they're good for 6 months. At the end of 6 months, it expires and will get removed. So I don't maybe not have to do an access review anymore because I have these controls over the life cycle. But I also can say, that person who was given access for 6 months, can they extend it? If so, does it require approval? You have all these sort of conduits to alleviate the access review fatigue because I can automate that life cycle, again, through all the features, not just one. The auto assignment policy, when I move, my access changes. LCW, when I move, my access changes. Or when my access expires, it gets removed. Then I can still use access reviews where necessary to a smaller portion where I don't have those controls today.
Right, understood. And one thought that comes up on the back of that is we think of organizations that are at enormous scale. And quite often what you'll find is maybe the identity team or the IT team or even the security team, they may not know what the what would you say, the ongoing access review requirement should be for a specific resource, right? So in your experience, when you're working with customers who are implementing things like entitlement management and access reviews and all that good stuff, how does that typically work out operationally? How much of this is delegated to the end user to kind of, the end user, by that I mean the non-IT folks, to decide and manage, versus how much is kind of centrally controlled by identity units and things like that?
So great question. So some organizations are very admin centric, right? Where they do not want to delegate anything to the business, where everything is a request to the admin goes and does the thing the business is asking for, right? So that is a centralized model. But larger organizations, that doesn't really scale so much, right? So delegation starts to come into play. So things like entitlement management says that as an admin, a central admin, I can delegate managing access to a portion of my environment. And the admin, that global admin, let's say, has control of saying, well, the sales leader can manage access to these 5 sales resources, whether they're groups, apps, whatever that is. And I can create something called a catalog, right? That catalog says these 5 sales resources, I've delegated that to the sales leader to go and create access packages to decide on their own, because they manage those resources. They know the risk of the access more than the IT admin does to determine what policy is appropriate. So you have these flexibility to say centralized admins, it's a traditional model, start delegating that into a more self-service. And that's where we really want to get those efficiencies, right? You want to have the guardrails of policy-based administration, not manual tasks by admins. And the platform is intended to enable.
Right, understood. To me, you can keep me honest here, but it seems to me like that's almost a recurring theme within Entra, is this idea of delegating access to kind of the lowest level that is possible, if that makes sense. So for example, I think back to many years ago now, when we first had Microsoft 365 groups, and these could be self-service creation groups. And at the time when all we previously had were things like distribution lists, that was a game changer, right? And mixed reception among IT admins. But over time, we kind of look at it and we're like, well, you know what? In the majority of use cases, that's perfectly fine. This concept of self-service group creation, things like that. Is that kind of how do you balance that when you're in the product team and you're thinking about how do we make our products usable by as many users as possible while balancing that kind of historic perception of how identity systems should be managed?
Great question. So when we're looking at what capabilities to bring to the platform for customers, security is first, right? We want to look at how the organization could use, should use, but we also think maybe how this could be abused in some way. So we think about those capabilities. So if you look at self-service, you're right. Some admins are very nervous about empowering the end user to make some decisions. And that's why we bring policy and guardrails, right? The admin still has those controls of how much control they want to delegate to the end users, and make sure that the controls that they want to put in place are enforced for any sort of self-service. So I talked about the automation, right? The HR data, the join, the LCW, the automatic assignments, but there's the additional step, right? Wherever I can automatically define based on the data, but not everything I can do that with, right? So there's a sales team. I gave you all your sales tools, but there's a super secret sales project. I don't know if you should be in that, but you know who does? The project leader. So I can actually delegate that approval capabilities to somebody else who is empowered about the business to make decisions. But now that end user can go to the My Access portal using self-service to receive what's available to them, how they request it, who has to approve. As an admin, I just created those guardrails. I put those policies in place and enabled the business to function, but function securely.
Thinking on that same trajectory of making the whole identity governance process more secure, I'm aware there's some degree of integration with things like entitlement management and verified ID, right? Which now verified ID being another part of Entra Suite. Honestly, one of the parts that's kind of, what would you say? Well, the technology for folks that haven't worked with it in the past, folks that have, like me, who've been working in IT for a long, long time, this is really unlike anything we've maybe historically had. Could you maybe give folks an idea about, number one, what is verified ID? And number two, if I'm that traditional identity admin who's all in on Entra, why should I care about also looking into verified ID?
Yeah, great question. So you're right. This concept of a verified ID is technically new, but we've been doing this with, I'll say, analog methods, right? So we know that we have things like government issued credentials, your driver's license, your passport, and we utilize this to verify the person presenting that credential is that person. And we do that typically by a photo today, right? Like your driver's license, your passport has some photos. So if I took your passport and presented it to an agent, they're going to know I'm not you, right? That's how we're verifying that. So we've taken this to a more digital place, right? We issue verified credentials using decentralized identities that are VCs, virtualized credential, or verified credentials. Now we can get these from partners, maybe the one who's focused on passports or DMV. You really get to pick what that partner is. But as an organization in Entra, right? If you're an Entra customer today, you actually can issue what's called a verified employee. So your organization is represented by an Entra tenant. You can enable and issue a verified employee VC. Now, how do we utilize that, right? So we understand the concept of authentication. I go to say, hey, I'm Jeff. I do some exchange, a password, hopefully not a password anymore, but some strong credential to say, yes, you are Jeff, and that's who it is. But that's Jeff's account. I don't really know who's behind the account, right? How do I know that person? So we're looking at ways of that when I'm looking at entitlement management, I have controls I put in place. One of those controls for getting additional access is provide a verified credential, right? So I can say that in order to get access to the finance share, which has a lot of sensitive data, to request access, I have to provide my verified credential. And in that process, we have this ability to do a face check. So with that, in that credential, HR has issued that credential with a photo. We can actually ask the user to present the credential, use their Microsoft Authenticator to do a selfie that stays on the device. And we actually give a score based upon the result of the selfie to what the picture is to the request, or in this case, entitlement management. Now, we can say if it's a high score, we're pretty confident it's Jeff. If it's middle, we're not sure. And if it's a low score, we're definitely going to decline that, right? So this is one way we can verify the person requesting access is the account user that we think it is. But we can go even further than that, right? So it's not just the self or the face check, but in the case of things like external collaboration. So we've typically in the world rely on email. You know I work for Microsoft because I have a Microsoft.com email. So you have this assumption that I'm an employee, right? But when I actually go to request access, I may say I'm the CEO of Microsoft. I have this email. But you require me to provide my verified credential from my organization, and they tell you I'm just a product manager. So we can actually utilize that authoritative data that we got from HR for our employees. We can actually get verified data about our partners that we can use in our governance processes now.
That's very interesting. Like I know, for example, a lot of folks that watch this podcast will be maybe in the Microsoft partner world. They'll maybe work for other Microsoft partners. And for example, the kind of work that we do, I as a consultant, I might have to go to my customer and say, hey, I'm Rue from Threatscape. I need to access your tenant because I'm going to do a project or something like that. Do you kind of foresee this world where that type of scenario, almost like a B2B type scenario, that can be augmented by this type of verified ID to help really just prove you are who you say you are beyond just being able to send an email?
Yeah, absolutely. Because in that verified credential, I have metadata that describes you about your organization, and I have an expiration. Maybe I want to say that when your VC requires your access to my environment also expires as well, right? So I can align that. So if you left that organization, I have a lower risk, right? Now, if you have a refresh credential, you can come and extend that access, everything I talked about earlier. But then we can also look at you as a partner coming in. I know you work for your organization, but I don't know if you're insured. Maybe I want to require a verified credential from your insurance provider to say you have good insurance. Or maybe you're coming to do a really important security project, and maybe you say you are the SME on Entra ID, right? But I want to require that you passed SC300 from your credential before I give you access to my environment. We can see where you could require those credentials from training providers before you give access to things. So as a partner, I can verify your employee. I can verify you are credentialed to actually do the things I'm bringing you on to do in my environment. So I have a lower risk that I have a knowledgeable person working in my environment.
Okay, so that's really interesting. It almost becomes during the recruitment process, I guess, all the way, you talk about joiners, movers, leavers, even before you get to the joiner state, you can kind of be looking at it to say, hey, we have this type of industry certification that's required. You have to pass the bar, all this kind of stuff. Medical is obviously big on certain standards you have to have and certifications. This type of technology can go all the way back to that stage to help folks make sure they're hiring folks that really are who they claim to be.
Well, typically the credentialing at hiring time is at an HR function. That doesn't always translate to an IT function. So we see this verified credential bridging that gap, right? Yes, HR did all of the government collection of PII information. You don't want to provide that same information to IT because now you have this information in the store. Now we can use these VCs that are issued from trusted partners to require and not have to present the PII to IT. You're providing the credential from the authority that you already issued the PII to. So yes, HR could technically issue a VC, right? Your training partner can issue a VC. And when you go to request access, we can make that a requirement that both those are valid before we can give you access.
It's interesting. And to what extent is that abstracted away from the internal IT folks? So, for example, you're talking about how you can have different partners who maybe manage passports or certifications and things like that. Is that a case where Microsoft established the relationship with passport providers, for example, and then the customer benefits from that without having to go to the passport provider themselves? Or what's the kind of relationship process?
Yep, great question. So with verified credential, you as an organization can issue verified credentials. Remember I talked about every Entra tenant can issue VCs about their organization. But when there are third parties, these are called providers or identity verification providers. They're part of the same network. We do not issue credentials on their behalf, right? You have to decide what your requirements are for what you want to verify. And then you go look at the catalog of providers and say, well, which one provides the thing I want to verify? So you get to pick who your provider is because that's who you're going to trust, right? So in your processes, you say, I trust this credential from provider X, right? So if provider Y comes, that's not good enough. You don't have a relationship with them. You've defined the criteria to verify for them to issue the VC that you will now trust in your process. So you're fully empowered to have one or many depending on your business needs.
That's great because different businesses will have different risk appetites and different trusted vendors and all that kind of stuff. Right, that's excellent.
Yeah, you can get things like academics, right? There's a whole world of academics out there, certifications and relationships, medical, right? Like depending on your business, there's a lot of these things that you may want to verify. Maybe you're doing drug trials. You want to verify if somebody's a doctor. The process is endless, but the key here is it's consistent that you can build upon, right? So verified credentials is a framework, right? You can utilize them in things like access requests, but we also see verified credentials in other scenarios, right? A very common one I often get asked for, employee onboarding. Like when I first started looking at this challenge of remote onboarding, I was shocked of how many impersonations exist during the interview process and the hiring process where you would discover the person you thought you were hiring is not the actual person who showed up. So we utilize verified employee onboarding for remote onboarding. If I don't have to go to an office in our modern world, how am I going to prove that that was not the person? So we use that in our onboarding. But then the other scenario that organizations struggle with is traditional help desk verification, right? Now, utilizing I'm going to send you an MFA prompt when you call the help desk. Please do not do that. That just trains users to just blindly approve MFA. So we want to verify the person behind the caller. We can use verified credentials the same way. We actually have on our GitHub several different projects, a project for a verified employee onboarding and the verified help desk, right? You call the help desk, you tell them to go to this website, they put their VC, it tells the help desk caller, yes, this is Jeff, their VC was to match this metadata. And if you had face check, what their face score was before you do anything on the phone.
That's really cool. You literally stole a question that I was about to ask and say, I think back to the days when we would all be in offices and it was a case of, you go to the IT help desk and you take your passport with you and then they'll reset your password or your pass key, obviously. You don't want to be using passwords. And I guess in the world where you literally have so many organizations now that are hybrid only or remote only is more to say. So that kind of achieves that. And I guess one thought that kind of comes to mind for me is how is the security of that VC specifically more testable than the security of something like an MFA prompt? So for example, if I say, hey, just we've got a phone number on record for you. I'll text that mobile phone and you read out the code for me. Why would a VC specifically be more reliable and more secure than something like that?
Well, I think as everybody probably listening to this podcast knows, mobile phones are not reliable at all, right? Like we've said for years, move away from mobility, telephone, SMS for things like MFA. Well, it's the same thing with verification. If I could steal your phone number for MFA, I could steal your phone number for verifying the help desk. So you still have that same challenge. We're moving to a stronger credential. That VC is a certificate based, right? So we have cryptography involved instead of just possession of a phone number, right? So we have a stronger assurance using a verified credential than something like an email or a phone that you don't know who's behind that email or phone or has control.
That answers it. It's funny you mentioned it's cryptographically based, because it's like when you start looking into things like passkeys and certificate-based authentication and guest fish-resistant authentication in general, and now VCs, you kind of think that, the maturity of authentication and authorization, it's certificates all the way down, right?
Yeah.
It's
some concept, yes. Yeah. I come from the years of carrying a key ring of smart cards, right? Where I had to have keys and cards for different things. Now I don't do that anymore, right? Like now my credentials are modern, right? We have my Windows Phone for Business. I'm actually using a Mac, so I use Platform SSO to do password list to all my resources, right? My mobile phone is my passkey provider. I don't use passwords. I have not used a password in 5 years at work, right? So it is a technology that secures an end user, but it makes the user life so much easier than managing passwords and MFA. It is the right direction for IT and end users, but basically it's the right for security.
Absolutely. Well said. And I guess on that note then, talking about win-wins, make life easier, plus make it more secure. Let's end on one final question for you. If you think across, I guess, Entra in its entirety, but also, identity governance, what's the one kind of call to action, that one underappreciated or overlooked thing that you just want to scream to folks and say, hey, if you're going to do anything, check this out? Great
question. So we've seen this transition to multiple islands of authentication and app access, to this transition to consolidated identity providers. Entra ID is the identity provider for Office 365, Azure, and any application, right? We're managing the authentication. But why are we managing access and authorization, some other tools, some of the process, right? Bring it together, just as we saw the evolution of authentication evolve and use that same common control plane for managing access where you are managing your authentication. Make it simple on your organization to have that common set of skills, common control plane, common set of audit and reporting, and common visibility. And for an end user, common ways to utilize access, request access, remove access. Don't do 5 different ways to manage something you already have the ability to centralize them in.
Love it. Great way to wrap up the episode. Jeff, if folks want to find you online, I know you're active, you're very helpful, you've been very helpful to me in the past. How can folks get in touch with you? Yeah, sure. So you'll find me mostly on Blue Sky. I'm at jefftech.com, JEFTEK.com. Feel free to reach to me there. I'm on plenty of different Discords, on Slack. But mainly Blue Sky is where you'll find me today. Awesome. Jeff, appreciate your time. Thanks for joining us. Thank you.